This is a production of Cornell University.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. So I'd like to start out with this figure here that shows the Earth. It shows electricity generation. Also shows some radiation from the sun in the green up here from the aurora borealis. And you can just see the atmosphere right on the edge of it, this thin blue line. So this really demonstrates that the atmosphere is a thin blanket covering the Earth. It's about, most of the atmosphere, about 80% is less than 10 kilometers. So it's very thin compared to the surface area of the Earth. And the atmosphere, of course, is this low envelope of gas. It protects us from radiation from the sun. It makes our climate so that we can live. It doesn't get too cold. It doesn't get too warm. And it also adds nutrients. We get rains. We get other nutrients from the atmosphere, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. But because the atmosphere is so thin, that means it can be easily modified. And we've seen this modification in the last century as the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere has increased. And many other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have also increased. And we've also seen that it takes very small concentrations of gases to have a large effect on the atmosphere. As our Giordano said, it doesn't take much to change the radiative properties of the atmosphere, air pollution properties, and other properties. So what I'd like to point out first, before we get going, is climate change is really one factor in a number of ways we're impacting ecosystems. We're impacting through air pollution, acid rain, land use change, biodiversity loss, and extinctions. And all these factors impact the world that we live in. And arguably, up to this point, climate change is perhaps not the most important factor. Diversity loss and extinctions are probably largely due to land use change. However, climate change and our means to adapt to it and our means to mitigate it may change many other systems. For example, if we grow lots of biofuels, that's going to change the landscape that we live on, and it's sort of opposed to efforts to rewild the ecosystems and the Earth. So climate change is going to impact many of these other aspects of the environment. In particular, I'm going to talk today about climate change and air pollution and how they interact together. So we've seen a figure like this before. So this is essentially the added energy that a number of atmospheric constituents, atmospheric gases, atmospheric aerosols are how they're changing the radiative budget of the planet. And one can see on the right here are gases that are warming the planet. And on the left here are gases that are cooling the planet. So we're emitting gases that do both, some warm and some cool. And the different thing about this chart here is it shows the species emitted. So for example, if one goes down here, the species emitted is nitrogen oxides. That's NO and NO2. So nitrogen and oxide are the two dominant constituents in the atmosphere, and they can form nitrogen oxides under combustion in cars, out of factories, etc. So nitrogen oxides is not a greenhouse gas itself, but when it's emitted to the atmosphere, it forms other species. It impacts ozone, which is a greenhouse gas, impacts aerosols, impacts methane. So many of the species we add to the gas, add to the atmosphere, the chemical reactions that happen in the atmosphere that change, and they impact different constituents. So one can see from this figure that CO2 is the dominant greenhouse gas. It contributes to most warming. Methane here is pretty large. And then as I said, nitrogen oxides and aerosols actually cool the planet. So one might think, well, why don't we add more nitrogen oxides and aerosols to the atmosphere? Maybe that would help. It would cool the planet more. Okay? But it just so happens that aerosols and gases produced from nitrogen oxides make atmospheric pollutants, which is bad to breathe, bad for agriculture, etc. Okay? The other point to make here is that aerosols contribute both negatively and positively. Some aerosols, the ones that are white, reflect sunlight back to space. There are also black aerosols that absorb sunlight from space and warm the Earth. So I've talked about aerosols. Here's a diagram of what aerosols in the atmosphere look like. They're very small particles. Sometimes they're covered with liquid. They're smaller than the human hair. And the ones that are really small, the ones that are less than 2.5 microns in diameter, are very damaging to breathe. Okay, so these small aerosol particles here, they can come from road dust, they can be bacteria, they can be diesel soot. If you get them into your lungs, they do a lot of damage. So what aerosols look like, this is what they look like up close, little particles. If you look at them from the air, they look something like this. So on the left might be if you look out an airplane window over LA, you might see a haze near the ground. These are caused by aerosol particles. And in this case, they're pretty white, and they act to cool the Earth. They're reflecting sunlight back into space. If you look on the right-hand side here, this shows a satellite picture of aerosols over India. And Indian subcontinent is often covered with aerosols from pollution. You can see here that they're not really white. They're kind of a gray, dirty type looking aerosol cloud over India. And these acts can warm, can cool. It kind of depends. So aerosols is something we emit that forms in the atmosphere and that mostly cool the Earth, but sometimes can warm it. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about what happens if you breathe some of these pollutants. And one pollutant we're going to talk about is ozone. The Environmental Protection Agency sets a pretty strict limit for how much ozone one can have. And ozone is composed of 3 oxygen atoms bonded together, and is produced from byproducts of combustion, and it's highly reactive. So you breathe ozone, it oxidizes your lungs. It also oxidizes plants and other things. Okay, so ozone is not emitted to the atmosphere, but is produced in the atmosphere itself. And is produced from what we've talked about before, nitrogen oxides, which is a species nitrogen oxide, or nitrogen and 2 oxygens together. And then through some atmospheric chemical reactions, these produce ozone. And then ozone, through more atmospheric chemical reactions, impact methane. So we can see that you emit nitrogen oxides. If the emissions of this go down, ozone goes down. That's good, because ozone is an air pollutant. Air pollution decreases. But methane in the atmosphere, due to other chemical reactions, goes up. So if nitrogen oxide emissions decrease, ozone decreases, pollution gets better, but methane goes up. And in fact, the net effect is that the climate warms. So if we want to decrease pollution, we decrease nitrogen oxides, we decrease ozone, but climate gets worse. So we can see when we're thinking about climate, there are lots of ways, lots of strategies, and they're not always win-win situations. With nitrogen oxide, it's not a win-win situation because it makes pollution better and warming worse. Okay? So this figure is current premature mortality linked to outdoor air pollution in 2010. And so what it shows is the mortality deaths per each square of the Earth, 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. So one can see that there's a lot of mortality due to aerosols and due to ozone, where there's high population density along much of India here and much of China here, and where there's high population density and high pollution. There's appreciable deaths from air pollution in the eastern US and in Europe, where there's a lot of industry and also a lot of people live. So globally, it's estimated that there are about 3.3 million deaths, premature deaths in 2010 due to air pollution attributed to ozone and to aerosols. Okay, this is meant to get worse. So this is from the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and it shows a number of environmental risks. Aerosols or particulate matter up here, ozone, unsafe water and sanitation, indoor air pollution, and malaria. And it shows how many deaths, millions of people die or are projected to die in 2010, the purple, 2030, and 2050 due to each of these environmental risks. So we can see in 2010, particulate matter kills about 1.5 million, is projected by 2050 to kill 3.5 million worldwide. Ozone, according to the study, is also projected, the deaths are expected to increase, whereas some other causes, unsafe water, sanitation, indoor air pollution, malaria, the deaths are expected to decrease in the future. Okay, so the European heat wave in 2003. So this was a severe heat wave, and it had severe pollution in it. Ozone was over 90 parts per billion in much of Europe, and many people died. This newspaper headline claimed 15,000, but it's actually many more. People look back, about 40,000 people or more died during this heat wave. And so it was hot, and there was a lot of air pollution. And the excessive mortality was both from heat and from ozone and from aerosols. And statistical studies suggested that in some cities, heat killed more people, in some cities, other air pollution, ozone killed more people. And these pollution levels were exacerbated by forest fires. So it got hot, it got dry, and lots of Europe burned that year. In Russia, 2010, a similar event occurred with combined heat and forest fires. There was also very high air pollution, very high heat, and it doubled the mortality rate in Moscow. So heat and air pollution tend to go together. And in the past, they produced quite a few deaths, quite a few rather catastrophic events. Okay. If we look at the temperature record during the summer, and so this was the temperature record this summer. One can see that 2002, the temperature was many standard deviations past what the temperature had been. So each of these dots here is a summer. It shows the mean temperature. You can see where the many bars, this is the temperature that the summers normally have been in Europe between 1864 and 2000. Okay? And the summer 2003 was a number of standard deviations to the right. So it's much hotter during that summer than it has normally been. If one looks at these two plots here, and the scale is down below. So this is model simulations. You can see that model simulations from a control period show about the same temperature. So this would be about 16 degrees here. This is about the observed temperature, about 16 degrees up here. So the models capture the present day pretty well. And if one runs the models into the future using projected emissions of greenhouse gases, you can see that summers of like 2003, where the temperature is about 22 degrees are going to be much more common. Okay? So this projection shows how air pollution and climate can march together. You have future summers, they're going to be much hotter. We might expect more biomass burning, more air pollution. Okay, ozone also impacts agricultural productivity. And it's a strong oxidant. It oxidizes your lungs. It also oxidizes plants. And so this is present-day ozone, and this shows essentially the loss of soybean, maize, and wheat due to air pollution in percent. So one can see over India here, about 25% of the wheat crop is lost because of ozone air pollution. China, 15 to 20. The US, about 10%. Okay? So this is quite in terms of metric tons, there's quite a few. There's a wide range. And there's billions of dollars lost annually. So if you grow a lot of crops, that's fine. But if you live in a place where you're just growing enough crops to feed the population, then this can impact food security. If you lose 25% of your crop by pollution, this is a lot and can be quite important. Okay, so as I mentioned before, you emit NO2, NOx from the ground, nitrogen oxides, and it increases air pollution, and it also it decreases air pollution, and it also makes climate warmer. So what's going on? And if we can look by satellite, and this is a species we can see through the satellite record. If we look in the last decade, we can see that the NOx emissions over the US here, or the NOx over the US and the NOx over India and the NOx over Europe here has decreased. So the blue colors here mean that there's less emissions of this species over the US and over Europe, and this is due to air pollution regulations. This species has been highly regulated in the US and in Europe for ozone air pollution. So what this means is that ozone over the US has dramatically decreased. It's also decreased over much of Europe due to these environmental air quality regulations. However, you look in other places, for example, much of China here, India, many countries here in the Mideast, the emissions of this pollutant has increased in the last 10 years. So this means that air pollution in these places, and particularly ozone, has increased, which is bad for health. Okay, so what we see is that NOx, okay, you decrease NOx, you make air pollution better, you make climate worse. And for aerosols, it's even more dramatic. Okay, so aerosols, as I said, mostly block light. They mostly cool the Earth. You emit aerosols into the atmosphere, and they act strongly to cool. So this shows two scenarios with using a model. One is 2030, where you let the greenhouse gases increase, and you let aerosols go as they are today. You let aerosols be essentially same emissions, and one can see about 1.5 degree temperature increase over much of the northern hemisphere. Okay? Now let's say we decrease the aerosols. We know how to do it. Aerosols, we know how to clean smokestacks, we know how to scrub them. So one have maximum feasible reduction of aerosols. Okay? And one would do this to protect health. Aerosols, as we showed before, causes a lot of deaths. And what one can see is that the climate here, instead of being 1.5 degrees warmer, now it's like 4.5 or 5 degrees warmer. So this is rather dramatic. We're protecting health, we decrease aerosols, but the climate becomes significantly warmer. Okay. So most countries that are modernizing are decreasing their air pollution. The US and Europe have decreased the number of aerosols that are emitted into the atmosphere, and they've decreased the number of NOx, which produces ozone. Developing countries, on the other hand, their emissions of these species are increasing. But the theory is that once developing countries industrialize, once they become wealthy enough, that they will also decrease emissions of these hazardous air pollutants, because people really suffer when the air pollution is too bad. So when it's a choice between air pollution and climate, in almost all countries, air pollution takes priority. That's where countries regulate. They regulate air pollutants. They don't regulate as much species that impact climate. And if you look at simple cost-benefit analysis, greater impacts are suggested by regulating air pollution. And as Dale Jamieson said in the first seminar of this series, when you regulate air pollution, you see tangible and immediate results. You see the air get better, you see health benefits, you may see agricultural benefits. When you regulate air pollutants like carbon dioxide, you don't see the benefits so much. They're more abstract, they're more distant. So most countries tend to regulate air pollution and not climate gases. So now we're going to go back, and we've discussed air pollutants, we've discussed ozone and aerosols and their regulation. Now we're going to look at strategies involving carbon dioxide and methane. Okay, so carbon dioxide is the largest driver of global warming. It is most positive on this side, but methane comes a close second. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and significant warming can be attributed due to methane too. So how do we think about this type of regulation of carbon dioxide and methane? What are the different effects of each of these gases in the atmosphere? Okay, and this is most relevant when one thinks of different pathways to go for energy. Okay? And coal, by all means, releases a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. Coal pollutes. It's very bad for the environment. And so we clearly want to get off coal and go towards green energy. Green energy both reduces pollution and it reduces warming. Okay? So we somehow want to make a pathway from burning these dirty fuels like coal to green energy, windmills, solar energy, etc. So one question is, do we go straight from coal to green energy? Or an alternative is to go through natural gas. You go from coal, you go to natural gas, which releases methane, or CH4, and you go that way to green energy. So you can either do pathway 1 or pathway 2, which is through natural gas. And the difference is CO2, carbon dioxide, and methane have much different impacts on the atmosphere. So natural gas releases methane. Considerably, methane is released during the extraction, during the storage, during the transport of natural gas, than during coal mining, etc. Methane does break down into carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So when you increase methane gas, when you burn gas, the methane breaks down into CO2 eventually. Coal releases substantially more CO2 per energy generated than methane. So when you burn coal, you're releasing much more CO2 than you are when you burn methane. Methane, though, has a lifetime of about 10 years in the atmosphere. When we say that 10 years, it means that in about 10 years, it goes away. That's a residence time in the atmosphere. It quickly decomposes at a time scale of 10 years into CO2 and water. CO2, though, however, is extraordinarily long-lived in the atmosphere. Once you put CO2 in the atmosphere, it stays here for a long time. On the other hand, methane has a rate of impact about 72 times that of CO2 on a 10-year time scale. So in terms of a greenhouse gas, methane is much more powerful than coal. So we can see that when we're choosing between burning coal and burning methane, we're choosing between very different types of species. One is much more stronger greenhouse gas, one stays in the atmosphere a lot longer. Okay, and so to understand what this trade-off is, we have to delve a little bit into CO2 and what happens to it once you release it in the atmosphere. So this is a figure. It's rather complicated. We could easily spend the next half hour talking about it, but instead I want to make a few points. So CO2, carbon dioxide, is released when you burn fossil fuels. And the red here shows present day where this goes. So these are the pools, fossil fuel pool, in gigatons carbon, and these are the fluxes. So when this figure was made, there were about 6.4 gigatons carbon released into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. You could date this figure because now the number is about 10. Okay, so there's much more emissions of carbon. It goes into the atmosphere, and then where does it go? Okay? You can see that it's exchanged. If you look at the red, this is where modern carbon is exchanged. You can see it's exchanged with the ocean, and a lot goes down into the ocean, and a lot goes up. And these fluxes here almost cancel. So a little bit more goes into the ocean than goes from the ocean to the land. You can see once it goes into surface ocean, it slowly is transferred from there deeper into the ocean, as shown here. You can also see that some of the CO2 that's released is going, according to this calculation, into vegetation. So the ocean sinks are much larger than the storage of carbon than the vegetation sinks. This is 2,300 here. This is 37,100 gigatons. So most of the carbon that's released will eventually go into the ocean. But there's going to be an equilibrium between the ocean and the atmosphere. You see some goes in, some goes out. Okay, so there's also always this constant equilibrium and flux between the ocean and the atmosphere, and to a lesser extent between ocean and land. So once we release CO2 into the system, it's not really going to go anywhere in a hurry. It's going to either stay in the atmosphere, some will go into the vegetation, some will slowly go into the ocean. Okay. If one looks at the lifetime, so we add a lot of CO2. This is essentially 1,200 ppm. So we're at 400 ppm. 1,200 ppm is what we would get if we sort of follow the trajectory we're following now. It looks like CO2 by 2100 in the atmosphere will be about 1,200 ppm unless we take dramatic actions in the next few years. Okay? So this time scale here is 100 years. This time scale here is 1,000 years, and this is 10,000 years, and down here is 100,000 years. So CO2 we put in the atmosphere. Within 100 years, it drops a little bit. It takes another 1,000 years to drop by about half, and it takes even longer to get out of the atmosphere. So on human time scales, if you think where people were 1,000 years ago, this was middle of the Middle Ages. This was middle of the Middle Ages in Europe. 10,000 years ago, agriculture hadn't even started. We put CO2 in the atmosphere. It's going to take that long to get out, over 10,000 years. So in the human time scale, you put it in, this is almost something what we're doing is permanent. Okay? And so this time scale here is pretty much equivalent to time scales of radioactive decay from nuclear reactors. This is what you think of it. This is, you put pollutant in, it's not going to go away very fast at all. Okay. What are the consequences of this? And so this diagram here, now it goes from 1,800 to 3,000 years. Okay, and if you pay attention to the first one, you grow the emissions here, and then you stop them. So at this point here, we've grown the emissions to 1,200 ppm. We stop the emissions, and CO2 now on the 1,000-year time scale stays pretty much in the atmosphere at its peak concentration. Okay? You might not grow the emissions as much, Maybe you stop them when CO2 in the atmosphere is 650 parts per million or 450 parts per million, but you see that the CO2 stays around for a millennium or longer. The surface warming, on the other hand, peaks. And you see that even though you put CO2, you cut the emissions, the surface warming is with us for 1,000 years. So this is temperature surface warming with this high CO2 scenario. The temperature stays the same. Even though you've cut the emissions, the temperature stays the same for the next 1,000 years. The thermal expansion of the ocean once you've cut the emissions. Here we cut the emissions. Right here, the ocean is about, the sea level has risen about 0.5 meters. At that point, it will rise in about another 1.5 meters in the next 1,000 years. So the thermal expansion of the ocean, even after you cut the emissions, keeps going. Okay. So what this means is that the temperature anomaly, the temperature that the Earth is projected to reach, the global temperature, is proportional to the cumulative CO2 emissions. Okay? So the cumulative carbon is the net mass of carbon released to the atmosphere in the form of CO2 by anthropogenic activities up to that time. So you take all the cumulative atmospheric emissions of CO2 from 1850 to present day, and this gives you a pretty good estimate of the temperature change. Okay? This also means that if you want to limit temperature by 2 degrees, here's 2, that means the total cumulative emissions that release to the atmosphere have to be about 800 gigatons of carbon. Right now, we're about 400, okay? So if we release, that gives us another 400 gigatons of carbon to release into the atmosphere. 500, even if we release them in 200 years, temperature is going to go above 200 degrees. So the temperature is sensitive to the cumulative emissions, and it doesn't really matter when they're released. That means that there's no sustainable CO2 emission rate compatible with climate stabilization. If you want to stabilize the climate, you really have to cut the CO2 emissions completely. Peak warming is proportional to the cumulative carbon release up to the time of CO2 emission cease, and is nearly independent of the emissions trajectory. So you know how much carbon you released, you know the peak warming. Okay? And it doesn't matter how you release it. And remember from what I showed before, the temperature at the time of peak warming is the temperature the climate remains stuck at for the next 1,000 years. Okay, so the current trajectory suggests that we'll release about 2,000 gigatons carbon by 2100, and that temperature will increase by about 4.5 degrees. The COP agreement in Paris and its extension limits the warming perhaps by 3.5 degrees by the end of the century. Okay, so carbon, an analog for carbon, is pouring something into a box. We're adding a source of water, say, into a box. There's no way for it to get out. And the carbon in the box, or the water in the box, increases. Okay, so the amount of fluid in the box, in the reservoir, in the bathtub, is determined by how much you've poured in from the beginning to where you are now. Okay, it's determined by the historical accumulation of sources. The ability of CO2 to warm the atmosphere is determined by the amount of CO2. So with very small losses from the atmosphere, how much CO2 warms it is going to be determined by the history of the sources from pre-industrial to now. Okay? Methane, though, is very different. Methane has a lifetime. It stays in the atmosphere for about 10 years. Okay? So this means you add a source to the atmosphere, you have a loss from the atmosphere. The source is greater than the loss. You increase the methane in the atmosphere until you reach some sort of stabilization where the source is a loss, and then the methane concentration will increase after that. You decrease the source, the amount of methane in the atmosphere will decrease until you have a new equilibrium where the source equals the loss. So this idea for carbon is much different than for methane. Methane corresponds to the instantaneous source, where you're at now. Carbon responds to the accumulated source. So what does this mean? That means, say, if we cut carbon emissions by 25% now, and we look at how much warming we saved over 200 years, this will compound itself. The warming we save is compounded by how much emissions we put into the atmosphere. So we cut now by 25%, there's going to be a long benefit time. There's going to be a lot of benefit over 200 years. Now what happens if we cut methane emissions by 50%? Methane, we cut the emissions, methane stabilizes, it's not going to do as much. The methane in the atmosphere is going to stabilize, and we saved about half a degree. Okay, so carbon, we cut the emissions cuts in carbon are much different than the emission cuts in methane. Okay. So what this suggests is that for methane, we can wait to abate methane. We could abate methane after 50 years, after 100 years, after 150 years, after 200 years, and in the end, the methane is going to relax to zero, and it doesn't matter really. These cuts, these changes in methane are reversible. So we can emit methane now, or we can emit it for the next 150 years. All this warming is reversible, or most of it, because the atmosphere rids itself of methane. On the other hand, for carbon, the atmosphere, on these time scales here, once we add carbon to the atmosphere, the carbon stays high over 1,000 years. So in this case, we get methane, is short-lived in the atmosphere, its residence time is small, the warming's reversible. For carbon, it's long-lived, and we essentially get irreversible warming. Okay. So this is a plot, and this shows degrees temperature versus calendar year. And what we're showing here is some sort of increase in carbon, and there are two choices here. One, we have an early mitigation of methane. Here we have a late mitigation, and this shows the trajectory of the climate. So it doesn't matter for methane whether we stop it now or whether we stop it in the future. We get to the same place as long as we stop the emissions. Okay? With no mitigation, so we mitigate carbon, but we don't mitigate methane ever, is we have about 0.5 degree warming over that of late mitigation or early mitigation. Okay? So it's important to mitigate it eventually, but when we mitigate it, it's not that important. It's not going to matter where we finally get to. Okay, and should point out that the late mitigation here and the early versus late mitigation, we do have a little bit cooler climate for a number of years over this period here. But in the end, it doesn't really make any difference. What happens if we think, okay, well, we don't know how to get rid of CO2, but we do know how to get rid of methane from the atmosphere? There are certain procedures to mitigate the methane emissions, to decrease them. Is that a good idea? So we could stop methane emissions now instead of stopping CO2? What happens then? Not a good idea. So so these are a number of different scenarios. This is year 1800 to 3000. This is temperature. This is early mitigation of methane, as I showed before. This is late mitigation in red. This is early mitigation in green. And in these scenarios here, we're saying, okay, we're going to emit methane, we're going to mitigate methane, an equivalent amount of methane for CO2. So we have this choice. Are we going to decrease emissions of methane? Are we going to decrease emissions of CO2? In these scenarios here, we decide, well, we're going to decrease emissions of methane and do CO2 later. That's a bad choice in the long run. You see, the climate becomes a lot warmer doing that. Okay, so you do achieve temporary warming. So this is this mitigation of black carbon and methane. You can do it early, or you can do it late. And when you look at it on this time scale here, this is 1900 to 2060, you can see quite a bit of advantage, apparent advantage in doing it early here. Okay, so this is mitigating black carbon, which warms the atmosphere, and methane. This is letting business go as usual, and there's about 0.5 degrees here. So you do see initially cooler climate. You see a delay in crossing this 2-degree temperature line, and it depends on how much carbon, how much delay is, how much carbon you're emitting. On the worst scenarios, you get a delay of about 9 years in crossing this 2-degree line. So it buys you 9 years, but eventually you have to mitigate carbon. So it's important to point out that in mitigating methane, decreasing their emissions does not buy time for mitigating CO2. You have to mitigate it now because it accumulates in the atmosphere. This short time period where you have about 0.5 degrees here, there may be less climate damage in the short run. It's about 1.5 degrees warmer than another. It may buy time for adaptation, but with eventual mitigation, as we move towards clean energy, it does not decrease the peak temperature that we'll reach. And mitigating only aerosols that warm the climate instead of mitigating all aerosols, the ones that warm and cool the climate, makes no sense. Mitigate aerosols because of air quality, people breathe them, it impacts your health now. Okay, so we talked about these alternative energy pathways. One is to go to coal, go to green energy. One is to go from coal to natural gas to green energy. And we talked about some of these different scenarios. The coal releases more CO2 by quite a bit. The natural gas releases more methane. And we talked about some of the differences between releasing CO2 in the atmosphere versus releasing methane. One has a long-term effect, one has a short-term impact. Okay? But it's possible that the transition to natural gas, if one goes from coal to natural gas to clean energy, this will delay the transition to clean energy because natural gas is cheap. Maybe people get stuck on natural gas and they won't want to go to clean energy. So this is one of the things one has to assess when you look at coal versus natural gas. Okay, environmental damage. Coal is tremendously destructive to the environment. Natural gas is also destructive, may impact groundwater, etc. But they're both, we really want to get off both of them. Which is worse? I don't know. I leave it up to you to decide. Okay, air quality. Air quality is much better if you burn natural gas than if you burn coal. The particulate matter, the aerosols that kill people, if you burn gas for its equivalent amount of energy, you get 0.1 gram released. If you burn coal, you get about 1,000 to 3,000. So in terms of air quality, natural gas is much cleaner than coal. And this is true for almost all these emittents. SO2, which forms aerosols in the atmosphere, NOx, which forms ozone, etc. Natural gas, in terms of air quality, is much cleaner. Okay, so the conclusions are, improve air quality. This is important. Even at the expense of short-term climate, air quality impacts people's lives now. Bad air quality has caused tremendous suffering, especially now in China and in India. Okay? Immediately decrease CO2 emissions. This is important because we saw the CO2 emissions have a compounding effect. They accumulate in the atmosphere. We want to decrease them now. Okay? And then we discussed two pathways. One goes from coal to sustainable energy. One goes from coal to natural gas to sustainable energy. One releases more methane. One releases more CO2. But in the end, you want to go on the pathway which releases less CO2 into the atmosphere. Okay? So these are the two priorities in my mind. improve air quality, immediately decrease CO2 emissions. And decreasing methane emissions is good. There's nothing wrong with decreasing methane emissions. It improves air quality a little bit. It cools the climate a bit, but it's not as important as these first two bullets here. Impact of methane is largely reversible, and one should not decrease methane at the expense of decreasing CO2. Okay, that's my talk. Thank you for your attention.
So everybody, we're going to take a few questions. If you have a question, I'm going to bring a mic to you because these are for the video. So no matter what, I'll bring the mic. I think you might hear that first.
It appeared early in talk that ozone will actually counteract in some way methane. Is that?
That's correct, yes.
Is that, but you would not have an ozone emission strategy as a methane control?
That would be a bad idea because ozone counteracts methane essentially by oxidizing it. Ozone also oxidizes your lungs.
Oh,
so to increase
it
ozone...
essentially just causes the mechanism is atmospheric oxidation of methane.
That's correct. Yeah.
And so you wind up with CO2 anyway.
Methane, when you oxidize methane, you do get CO2, yes.
Thank you.
If you're really glad to hear your discussion of this, I've been waiting to hear what you had to say about these issues. So just to make sure I understand clearly some of the take-home messages. One is that, CO2 is the big culprit. Methane has a small impact, but more immediately reversible, but still we just have to not forget our focus on CO2 in the long term. But, so two questions about methane. One is you would not argue, I don't think, with the point that psychologically the idea of tackling methane now would have a more immediate effect. So for example, the politicians and society in general would see an impact more quickly. So from that standpoint, it could have more benefit. Is that correct? And then I have one more quick question.
Okay. I think it would be a mistake to tackle methane instead of tackling CO2. Okay? Because CO2 accumulates. Methane is largely reversible in the atmosphere. So it's great to mitigate methane. There's nothing wrong with it, and it has a number of benefits. But if you choose to put your energy in mitigating methane emissions instead of CO2, that would be a mistake.
Yeah. But it wouldn't have a faster kind of response time that people might.
It does. It would impact the climate. Whether people would see it or not, I don't know. That's, as you know, climate is tremendously variable, and who knows? But it would have a faster impact on climate, yes.
My second question has to do with where the methane is coming from. So there's been an exponential rise since the population's been going up, primarily associated with feeding people more ruminant animal products.
That's correct.
And so that's the big contributor to methane. There's manufacturing contributions and more recently fracking. But it seemed like you were alluding to, well, it could be kind of simpler to reduce methane, but that would mean a major change in the human diet, it would seem to me. Would you agree?
Well, there are ways to mitigate methane emissions, for example, from landfills. There are ways to, for example, with the decomposition of manure to collect methane, etc. So there are ways to mitigate methane. In many ways, they are cost effective because you can later burn the methane to generate energy. So you can take, a lot of methane, you're right, comes from increase in agriculture, but you can mitigate some of it.
I have some questions here. I'll take them.
So you said that methane breaks down into carbon dioxide eventually. So does that contribute to the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere?
Yes, it does, yeah. So when you burn methane, it does contribute to accumulation of carbon dioxide, but because you get more energy per methane molecule than per coal, per natural gas and coal, you end up contributing less per the amount of energy you get out. Okay, so eventually, yes, you don't want to keep burning methane either, but it does not contribute as much to carbon dioxide as some other fuels.
You said that if we decrease aerosols, we decrease mortality directed to air pollution, but and then increase the severity of climate change. Do you know if more projected deaths would be caused from future aerosol inhalation and air pollution, or the increasing temperature up to 4 degrees Celsius and the repercussions of that warming?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think deaths due to climate change may not be accurately tabulated because they're hard to attribute. Okay, so the thing is about aerosols is it causes a direct and obvious decrease in deaths. Okay, climate, the decrease in deaths might not be as direct. For example, if we decrease our CO2 emissions, it may eventually help people who live in Bangladesh and may be flooded by increasing sea level rise, but it's not immediate. Okay.
Question from the WebEx. While CH4 has a far shorter half-life in the atmosphere than CO2, its greenhouse gas effect is far greater over a short period on global warming. Should we not consider the compounded effect of short-lived effects as they are combined with CO2 and create short-term climate effects that end up exacerbating long-term effects after the CH4 damage is already done? An example is decomposition attributable to high CH4 levels and have a knock-on effect on rising CO2 later.
That's a long question. There's nothing wrong in mitigating methane now. My point was if it's a choice between mitigating methane now and mitigating CO2, it's better to go for CO2 because it has a long-term impact out for millennium. Methane, it may cause some temporary damage, maybe, in the short term, but in the long term, the effects are reversible. We can decrease methane emissions at any time, and the impact of those, the temperature impact of those will go to zero or decrease.
Yeah, I have a question about the possible role of short-term tipping points and things like melting of glaciers and things like that, and if there's any concern about short-term warming that might be attributable to methane in that context, or are you primarily looking at, I'm sorry I missed the beginning, but in what I saw at the end of your lecture, you were really focusing on the long-term trajectories primarily.
Right. It's true if there was a strong tipping point from 0.5 degrees C, then we might be more interested in the short-term mitigation. But with the climate variability as it is, I don't believe that there's going to be a long tipping point from going above 0.5 degrees C for a number of years. Okay? And I don't know of one that has been identified. You're right, there's more melting of glacial ice, but in the long run, you've delayed it by a few years. Okay?
Hi, just a quick question on, asking for a clarification on the terminology that you've used. Sometimes in this lecture you've called CO2 carbon emissions.
Right.
Methane is also carbonaceous, and so actions like fees on carbon would address both types of emissions. Is that not correct, or maybe you could clarify?
Yeah, if that is true. They both contribute to atmospheric CO2. If you wanted to just do fees on carbon itself, maybe they should contribute the net CO2 released eventually. They should contribute equally. But if you take the warming potential of methane into effect and say we'll save you so much money because there's less global warming potential. Mitigating methane in the end gives less global warming potential in the short term than CO2. That would be a mistake, I think.
Any other question?
I think one difficulty what we see happening, I mean, when you just focus on which one should you mitigate, that's one thing. But a lot of what's happening in the U.S. are attempts to convert coal burning plants to natural gas burning plants. So it's not just a question of mitigating, there's a lot of pressure to do a switch over and increase the methane rather than just keeping that stable. And while you get the CO2 going down. And so I think that's a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, you can see in my talk, I kind of dodged that question. And in the end, whether you go from coal to methane to clean energy or go from coal to clean energy, whichever process in the end emits less CO2 into the atmosphere, that would be the advantage from climate warming. And you're right, going from coal, converting coal plants to plants that burn natural gas might, in the end, lengthen the time when we convert to clean energy. And in the end, it may emit more CO2 into the atmosphere. I don't know the question, the answer to that. I mean, it's a good question, and in that case, you can make the case that it's better to go straight from coal to clean energy without going through natural gas. I don't know which one buys you less in terms of emissions of CO2.
You had a chart earlier that showed basically the carbon budget for the surface of the Earth, what comes and goes in the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land. Do the models that you've used have give you an indication of how much feedback, how much positive feedback there will be from, say, methane hydrate coming out of a warmer ocean, or methane from thawing tundra? We have policy control, or we could, but there's some things over which we may have no control.
Yeah. I would say that, well, the latest projections of either hydrates coming from the ocean suggest it's not that large a concern. And the tundra is an open question. There may be some more methane emitted from them in the next 100 years. So these are positive feedbacks that I think are, especially the tundra, the idea is if you warm the tundra, you'll release more methane, and that warms the atmosphere more. That feedback is not well constrained. And the models really are not good enough to get it now. The models don't really offer constraints on that.
Here, we have two different questions here from the WebEx. I would like to know if you think that green energy can be ramped up enough to make natural gas bridge unnecessary. Natural gas is a bridge. And then second question, where the large mass of CH4 pollution occurs from, is it more from the extraction of natural gas or the combustion of natural gas?
Let me go for a second one first. Where does methane released? It's released, as far as I know, in the extraction. Most of it's burned in the combustion. Okay. For the first, I don't know if fossil fuel and if green energy can be ramped up quickly enough to do a quick conversion. In my opinion, it depends on government action to get that going. Government subsidies, cost of gas, cost of carbon, etc. So I don't know if it can be done quickly enough or not. It's not being done that quickly now.
Knowing all that you do about the different features and subtleties of the constituents of our atmosphere, what do you think the feasibility of implementing large-scale atmospheric scrubbers and carbon sequestration technologies in the future to help reduce some of those levels of CO2?
My opinion, and this is only my opinion, is that that is a risky way to go. I think that in my opinion, the technology has not been proved. No one's really been able to scrub the atmosphere at large scales. It depends on carbon sequestration, which has only been, there's been a number of trials of carbon sequestration, but widespread use of carbon sequestration hasn't been accomplished. So people are thinking about it. In my opinion, to count on that would be risky. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the most common way to scrub carbon out of the atmosphere is to consider growing a lot of biofuels, and you take it up into the plants. And that's going to cause a lot of changes to our landscape. And do we want to do that? I don't know.
I guess my questions have been covered a little bit already, but I think the data you showed us is very convincing about the impacts 2,000 years from now in terms of the choices we're making. But there's, for many populations, a sense that that short-term graph that you showed us that seemed almost trivial in the context of 2,000 years, but it was this entire century, determines the fate of island nations, of coastal cities, of huge populations on the earth having to migrate and move. So it seems less, and you are also sort of discounting the idea, well, maybe there could be positive feedbacks, but we're not sure of any of them, so let's not worry about them. It seems clear that we have to mitigate carbon dioxide and get rid of that, but to discount methane because of a 2,000-year perspective seems reckless.
Well, I don't think it should be discounted. I think I completely support methane mitigation. I just think if it's a choice between CO2 and methane, it's more reckless to buy ourselves this type of long-term climate change in timescales of thousands of years than for more reversible change. I mean, it's true. 0.5 degrees may give us more time for mitigation. It might save an island nation another 10 years before they have to evacuate. Maybe that kind of...
More permanently, if it gives us time to actually do the CO2 mitigation as well. I mean, I would never argue that we should do one versus the other.
I think the point is we're making, we should do both, but if it's a choice between methane and CO2, if it's a choice between coal and natural gas, you should take the pathway that releases less CO2 in the end. I'm not sure what the pathway is because there are complications of how fast we can convert to green energy. But I think my feeling is we should take the pathway that gets us to releasing less CO2 quicker. Okay? But you're right. I mean, don't discount emitting methane. I think methane, if we can do something, let's do it. Just let's not do it at the expense of CO2.
Thanks everybody so much for your questions. That might be all we have time for today. If you have questions, come up and ask Professor Hess after, but let's thank him one more time.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.